want to start now. I want to start now, though. Okay, are they going to? A very good morning and welcome to day 2 of the South African Cultural Observatory's 4th International Conference. My name is Nzinga Kunta and it's such a pleasure and a privilege to be your program director at this event that brings together academics, members of the creative sector, government, business, the media, and more to discuss the creative economy reset. We had very rich and fulfilling dialogues and presentations yesterday and hope to continue on that trend today with a focus on African views and cases. Just a reminder of our house rules, please may I ask that you put your phone on silent now. Wi-Fi can be accessed for free by clicking on the ICC Wi-Fi or checking on the back of your tag on how to do that. Just a reminder that there is a phenomenal event by the British Arts Council together with Saco tonight at the Javits Arts Centre. Please make your way there. You can sign up on the website for that. Or if you stay in Tshwane or Gauteng, you know how to make your way there. Our hashtags for the day are Saco 2022 and SACONF 2022. Please may I implore that both the moderators and speakers check your allocated times for your sessions and stick exactly to that. If you ever see me rocking up onto the stage at any point, please wrap up so we can make sure that we are exactly on time today. Let's begin then. Our first panel, please may I ask the chair, Mr. Johnny Muteba from the American Arts Chamber and Mr. Utando Baduza from the Nelson Mandela University to make their way to the stage, as well as their guests, and a round of applause for them, please, as they do so.
Good morning and Ngamaku colleagues. My name is Utando Baduza. I am the Chief Curator of Relocation Art Gallery, as well as I serve on the steering committee for the Saco project. It gives me great pleasure today to be the chair for this morning's plenary, which is creating space and value, shifts and new approaches. I'm co-chairing the session with Johnny Muteba from the American Arts Chamber. Our first speaker today is joining us virtually. So I don't know if he's set up and ready to go. His name is Dr. John Sipho, who is a senior lecturer at the Science Policy Unit at the University of Sussex. Currently, he's working with UK Creative Industry Policy and Evidence Center as the lead for creative clusters, regional inequality, R&D, and access to finance. So let's give him a warm welcome. Thank you.
Hello, and thank you very much for having me. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a real honor and a pleasure to be asked to participate in this event. And my only regret is that I can't be there in person. Looks phenomenal. The program just looks brilliant, and I just wish I could be with you in person. My name is Dr. Josh Sipho. As the introduction said, I'm based at the Science Policy Research Unit at the University of Sussex. I've also, for the past 5 years, been working with the AHRC Creative Industries Policy and Evidence Center, where, pardon me, I've been looking at leading our work on creative clusters, innovation, and access to finance. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to just spend my talk today explaining a little bit to you about some of the stuff that we've been thinking about around creative clusters and some of the frontiers that we're wrestling with in the UK, with the hope that that will actually give us some ideas and some perspectives that might help to shape the conversations that you'll be having in this session today. So to begin with this, when we think about creative clusters are a very dominant technique and approach that we see across approaches to the creative economy, creative industries over the course of the past 20 plus years. It's a very well-known approach, and there's been a lot of work on it. So at the very start of the center that we were working on, we did a review of the academic literature on creative clusters. We read 350 academic papers and loads of other policy documents. We read all this stuff. We said, okay, we know a lot about creative clusters in terms of the context of academic things, but what does it actually really properly say for us? What does it actually tell us from the perspective of what we for me as an academic, what I can say to policymakers, this is what you should be doing. And we found that actually there's a lot that could be done to boost our understanding of creative clusters. And so on that basis, we began to explore and think a little bit more about some of the issues around creative clusters and tried to really deal with some of the uncertainties. And our starting point for this was actually thinking about questions around how do we actually define creative clusters? And that sounds kind of obvious, and I think, and other presenters have, I believe, touched on this as well. But there are a couple of issues that we found. Some of these are particularly in the context of the UK, others are in other circumstances. But we found a couple of key issues that we think when we say, okay, what is a creative cluster? And and some of these things that emerge to us. One of them is the fact that it's very difficult to actually identify the geographical boundaries of a creative cluster. So in some of the influential work that colleagues at Nesta in the UK had done in the UK, they'd come up with some maps of creative clusters, which included things like London is a creative cluster. Well, realistically, that's not a huge surprise. I mean, London is a city with, 10 million people. It probably is a creative cluster. So what? And so, at what point do we actually say the geographical boundary for this is actually useful or it possibly isn't? Okay. We've also begun to deal with issues around things like industry definitions. In the UK, we use the UK SIC codes, which haven't actually even been updated since, properly updated since 2007. So, before apps were a thing. So how do you actually measure what's going on? And there's been multiple pieces of work in the UK that show that the industry classification techniques that we use in the UK are by and large, miss, in some cases, a third, in some cases, more than half of what we would say creative companies, because they just didn't tick the right box when they registered the company. And so across this, plus also things thinking about more creative ecosystems and creative communities and things like this, often when we think about creative clusters, we tend to think about it in terms of businesses, because businesses are easy to measure. But what about cultural organizations? What about charities? What about community groups? What about local mobilizers and things like this? And so part of our interest in trying to come to terms with what's going on around the creative clusters in the context of the UK was to try to figure out ways to address this. Now, what we did as a way to address this, and it managed to, I think, come out relatively well, is we created a project that we called Creative Radar. And the idea behind Creative Radar was to try to use new, novel techniques to really deal with some of these sort of methodological challenges, but also to give us some new insights about the creative clusters in the UK. And the starting point for this was, rather than simply starting with saying, okay, we're going to look at a list of companies that are registered somewhere, we used company websites as our starting place. Because in the UK, you can register your company at your accountant's office, and that doesn't have to actually be where you're actually doing business. Whereas if you put your address on a website, you put it there because you want your customers to be able to find you. So we used a technique where we scraped the contents of all websites in the UK with our partners Glass AI, and we used these to generate a map of we had 300,000 creative industries business websites And we mapped those onto the UK. Of those, we had about 200,000 websites that we mapped onto the UK. And then what we did is, rather than using a top-down approach, saying we're going to use this particular geographical boundary of local authorities or any number of other predefined geographical boundaries to identify where the clusters are, we used a data-based approach where we ran an algorithm which was trying to identify agglomerations of cases where you have at least 50 organizations, because you have not necessarily businesses, but you've got cultural organizations, you've got charities, etc., and those all have websites as well. So we're picking those ones up. Now, once we did that, we said, okay, we were trying to identify 50 of these businesses or organizations within a 500-meter radius. And when we actually did that, we managed to identify 709 distinct creative microclusters in the UK. And this is really interesting, because what this approach allowed us to do is it allowed us to go beyond saying, okay, London is a creative cluster. Well, yes, London is a creative cluster. We know that. But actually, if we look at what's going on in the creative clusters, it's not difficult to see, actually, that really, in terms of creative clusters, often the real exciting thing is not necessarily at the city level. It's often the neighborhood level. It's at the shared working space. It's in very small ecosystems. And what this approach of the microclusters allowed us to do is to say that it's not that London's got one cluster, because it's not. What we said is we found, okay, inside London we found over 200 distinct microclusters. There's a microcluster around in Soho, there's a microcluster in Shoreditch, there's microclusters in all sorts of other places. And as we looked at this analysis through the UK, it began to show us really interesting things. And in some cases, you have clusters that are distributed across a whole town, but in other cases, you have microclusters that are focused on very small, distinct buildings in some cases, or a couple of streets, one street even. And this is really interesting, because this actually tells us, okay, there's something really interesting going on here. There are people here, they want their customers to find them, and they are right in this place. Okay, so we did that mapping and said, okay, that's fine, cool, right, we've done a map. Yay, maps are fun, we like maps. So what? And so what we did with building on this work is we then used that as a sample frame for surveying companies. And our first survey that we ran was just under 1,000 companies, and that was a survey that ran from January to March in 2020, ending on the day that the UK went into its first COVID-related lockdown. So we had a really nice snapshot of what was going on with companies before the COVID pandemic. Now, we surveyed those companies, and then we subsequently received support from our funder to go and resurvey companies again, twice more. And so we've just finished the second wave of those surveys. So we surveyed companies a year after the original COVID lockdown, and then we resurveyed them again this past summer. And we're working on those results, which we'll be publishing in due course. And what these results showed us are a couple of really, really interesting things from the perspective of clusters. Now, part of what it showed for us is some things that, to be honest, those of us who are on the academic side, who study clusters, we kind of already had a pretty good idea. So companies that are in large established creative clusters, as defined by big, large, well-known geographies, they tend to show classic, what those of us who are more on the academic side would say, classic signs of agglomeration. So they leverage their proximity through access to skills. So they're more likely to use freelancers as the basis for their competitive advantage. They have more customers in a local area. They get their ideas from within. They get their ideas and their new sort of their new ideas from within their cities, and they tend to view local lifestyle as a basis for their advantage. So it's kind of a classic sort of amenities type approach, and saying, well, if you're in a big place, you've got lots of customers, and you're able to access labor, and all the sort of classic things that we, as people who study creative industries and study clusters, think, okay. Where it got really interesting, though, was when we started looking at the microclusters. Because the picture that we got of the big established clusters, yeah, okay, that's pretty much what we would expect. Where it got really interesting, though, was when we started thinking about the microclusters. Because what we did was we looked at where you have microclusters, let's say microclusters in London, right? Microclusters in London basically behave like the rest of London, okay? Because you can go and it does, you know, within a certain limit, if you're in London, you can hop on the London Underground and you can get to somewhere else pretty easily. But we found that companies that were in these microclusters, but outside the big established creative clusters, had some really interesting, unique characteristics. Because what we found was these companies that were outside of the major creative clusters. The first thing was that they wanted to grow more than companies inside the big established clusters. It was really interesting. The other thing we found is that these companies, they generated a lot more of their revenue from local business. And they get their ideas from local areas. But at the same time, they have a number of other distinctive characteristics because they want to grow, they have some similar problems, but at the same time, they were also really much more likely to be financially constrained. And so it's a really interesting issue because one of the things that we know from work around the creative clusters more broadly, and I think is a well-established issue, is that there's a lot of inequality in the location of creative industries. So creative industries, as we know, they tend to be heavily clustered in places, and often those places where they are clustered tend to be more well off. Whereas some of the things that we were finding is even in these companies that were in places that were outside of those areas, possibly weren't necessarily in places that were as well off, they actually had a lot of growth potential, but they weren't reaching. They didn't have access to the finance, they didn't have access to the resources that they wanted. And so this is a really interesting picture that actually is pointing to possible different life cycles for creative clusters. That there are these nascent creative clusters that are emerging, that are not the big ones, they're not the really well-established ones, and they don't necessarily have all of the same mechanisms that you would necessarily be expecting to see in these creative clusters, but you do see some part of it. And this is a really interesting issue from the perspective of tackling regional inequality, which is a big issue that we're currently spending a lot of time thinking about in the UK right now, inequality between the wealthier south of England and the north of England. This actually points to some really interesting issues around how we can try to possibly tackle and address this. So on that basis, as we started tracking some of these companies over the past few years, we've seen that location hasn't actually seemed to matter that much in the context of disruption from COVID. So when we tracked companies over the period around COVID, what we found was, quite interestingly, that by and large, where there were disparate impacts, the disparate impacts were largely sector-based. There was a differentiation between and among sectors, but there wasn't actually that much of a difference between clusters, between regions, between microclusters and things like that. It didn't actually seem to be that much of an issue. So with the remaining time that I have, I'd like to just spend a little bit of time sharing with you some of the recent programs and sort of developments that have been happening in the UK around supporting clusters, some of which are more explicitly targeted towards a microcluster-based approach. Some of them are less so, but just to sort of flag up some of these. So there's the UK, the Creative Industries Policy and Evidence Centre that I've been working on has been focusing for a number of, completely lost my train of thought. The Creative Industries the Creative Industries Policy and Evidence Centre was funded as part of the UK industrial strategy. At the same time, there was a big chunk of money that was invested in what was called the Creative Industries Clusters Program, which is an R&D-based program that's really trying to drive university-industry relationships around key sectors in the creative industry. So around particular areas, so textiles and design, for instance, or screen sectors, or immersive VR, MR, AR, things like that. And so this has been one thing which has been a very interesting thing where the aim has been focusing with universities to build relationships out around innovation in the context of creative industries with the aims of developing more robust local ecosystems. And this is a really interesting program which is nearing its conclusion now, and there's the evaluation for this is going to be very interesting. I've seen some interesting stuff around evaluation of a similar program that's called Audience of the Future, which was specifically more around R&D for immersive sectors, but also had a spatial component as well. And some of the issues around evaluation there are really, really interesting. Not sure how much evaluation interest there is in the audience today, but I'll just leave there if anyone's interested in that. I can point people in the direction of some really, really clever evaluations that are going on around that. A couple of other initiatives that are going on there, really building on some of the work that we've identified around microclusters and access to finances. There's a program called the Creative Scale-Up Program and its successor, the Create Growth Program, which are specifically aiming to boost access to capital, both in terms of demand for capital as well as supply of capital, outside of the big established areas that don't have any problems getting money, so namely London and, generally speaking, the southeast of England. And by targeting outside those areas, it's trying to deal with these issues around untapped growth potential. And there's also some really interesting work around trying to build clusters around cultural assets in underdeveloped areas. There's a program called the Cultural Development Fund that Arts Council England have been doing, where they've been trying to invest in these assets with the idea of doing that. So, in conclusion, a couple of things that we have found from our perspective, thinking about creative clusters in the case of the UK, which may be useful for you looking forward, and things that we're interested in, some of the frontiers that we're seeing. I think one of the things that our work has really shown us is that there's a real need to understand and better explore the life cycle of creative clusters, understanding how they start, how they grow, and how they die, or if they don't die, how they fade away, or whatever. That's something which we are very interested in, and I think is a really important thread for policymakers to be able to say, here is a way of actually thinking about this, and here are approaches that we know that work. And so we're thinking about ways that we can actually generate more robust evidence around that. Some other key themes, as I mentioned briefly earlier, evaluation is huge. Evaluation is a major, major issue, and we're very keen to be trying to build that up and to be making that a more robust area. And particularly, there's some interesting work, as I was mentioning before, that's actually trying to do issues when we're talking about interventions at a local level, how we capture impacts at the region sector level. So we're actually not just saying, okay, what's happening here, but how do we actually say, how can we capture an impact not of individual companies, but for an entire sector or an entire ecosystem? And how can you actually then figure out the counterfactuals around that? The other thing that I will say, and then I will bring my talk to a close, is just a broader issue around, that we're very much aware of, around issues around equalities and inclusion and opportunities. And we're keen to try to see how we can understand and develop policies that will ensure that the opportunities that are posed by work in the creative industries and creative sectors are open to everyone. I know in the UK, for sure, there is a view that and there's evidence that the creative industries and creative industries work tends to be dominated by people from certain more privileged socioeconomic backgrounds. And how can clusters and cluster policy be designed to open that up, to ensure that there's a range of opportunities for everyone? So on that basis, I'll close my talk. I hope that's interesting in the context of things that have been going on. I'm happy to have any questions either now or at the end of the session.
Thank you. Thank you, Josh, for some wonderful insights on how we can leverage creative clusters. What we will do is take questions after all the presentations, then we can engage you further on that. Our next speaker is Dr. Leslie Banks, who hails from the National Department of Science and Innovation, and he will be talking to us about placing the smart city innovation infrastructure and inclusive urban development in South Africa. Let's give him a warm welcome.
There's so many formats here. I've actually never been in front of a monitor like this. Should I stand? Hello. Okay. Is that coming through? How am I going to move the slides with that? Then, but I still need a few pages. While just a few. The rest I can do. Just my introductory pages. So let me just introduce myself. My name is Leslie Bank, and I'm kind of an academic anthropologist, and have been for a lot of my life. And what I am interested in is understanding the cultural economy rather than narrowly the creative part of it. And so that really involves kind of tracking people in the everyday settings and really paying a lot of attention to the meanings that they generate around their activity in that kind of understanding of culture, not as something that is that is on the market or a commodity, but something that is lived. And so it's really from that perspective that I have two things to offer really to this discussion about the reset. And I think in yesterday's plenary session, this whole question of the suspension of culture during the pandemic emerges a really interesting point. So everyone kind of talks about jobs and politics during the pandemic, but there's very little discussion about culture. And I think it's really fundamental, and I think it's not just a matter of resumption, it's really a matter of reset. And that moment of reset creates fundamental opportunities for new practices. And I think that maybe didn't come out strongly enough yesterday. The suddenness, the shock, the precarity, but the possibility. And I think that cuts over into the kind of creative, cultural to the creative. So there are two things that, because we're all locked down and we write as academics. So I wrote two kind of books while I was busy. And the first one I want to talk about, for just you can change to the next slide, just very briefly, is this book, which has just come out, which is about the impact of the pandemic in rural South Africa. And here we are here. So yesterday, Professors Baba and Andy Pratt really engaged us in a really fascinating plenary session where they highlighted the suspension and disruption of culture during the pandemic. Professor Homi Baba spoke particularly about existential issues and moral issues and the whole dilemma of citizenship. And the reason why I want to raise this book as a story is that he spoke about how freedom was fundamentally connected to mobility. And the failure to recognize refugees and the refusal of mobility is the denial of citizenship. And it seemed to me to resonate particularly powerful with this piece of work that I did in rural communities in South Africa with my colleague Nelly Vuyakazi Sharpley from the University of Walter Sisulu. He also spoke about the importance of convergence and the third space and how somehow we had lost that, we had been polarized into ethno-national blocks and divisions, and that we kind of missed that third space. So if you can go to the next slide, I just want to highlight a few things about what I found about this kind of process of cultural change. So basically the premise of the book is that these rural hinterlands in Southern Africa and South Africa are predicated on translocality. The human economy is not an economy of permanence, not urban permanence nor rural permanence. It's predicated on circulation. All our policies are based on trying to enforce urban permanence and settlement or rural development and commercialization. But the majority of poor families circulate between urban and rural spaces, and that constitutes their very survival. Without those bits and pieces of social grants, together with the casual incomes that are earned in town, they can't really survive. And it's an important constitution through ritual of kinship and relatedness, of clanship, that really creates the fabric of this existence. And it's not a new phenomenon. It's not something that came with the end of apartheid. It has been there for 150 years in South Africa because we are predicated on a system of enforced labor migration. The critical thing is that that system became so embedded that people made it themselves their own way of life because they were forced into it. So at the very core of that was the idea of ritual. So when the pandemic arrived and then cancelled people's customary practices, including funerals, as well as locked them down, they were unable to reproduce themselves. It became a cultural crisis of social reproduction, where they could no longer reproduce their identities, their sense of belonging, their notion of home, and they had to perform death rituals under very extreme and frightening conditions, like bodies being wrapped in plastic bags when people's belief systems were predicated on spirits moving on from the dead, etc. It was hugely fearful and traumatic for people. And this ethnography of mine documents that as a process of change, and I can't go into all the details, but I do think that this kind of the dominant global regime of individualized biomedical care is so fundamentally at odds with people's understanding of social humanness and social being. And no effort was really made, I'm sorry to say, or significant effort was made by our government to deviate from the globally dominant view. In fact, we tried to prove how we in Africa were leading the way, closest to China, closest to America, in pretending we could deliver a biomedical solution, particularly in areas that had very little chance of actually succeeding in that regard, like the rural areas. So all services were almost immediately suspended, which compounded the dilemma for people. And so that this wasn't exposed, there's quite a lot of police enforcement in these areas to make sure that everyone didn't find out that, we weren't coping in those areas. So literally, over 100,000 people get arrested for trying to move, for example, when they're not supposed to, because that's their thing. So I think that's a really interesting book about the suddenness, the terror, and the force of rural lockdown and its impact on people's now, the reset moment has been defined by a lot of discussion about hunger, grants, youth saying, you can't access my body unless you give me something in return. There's a kind of transactional anger there that has emerged out of the experience of the pandemic where people are wanting something in return. And I think it's really interesting to think about how that will be reset. So there I've spent probably half my time talking about that project. The other thing that I wrote, which I'll talk about briefly, and I'm also concerned about this kind of growing cultural economy, about this idea of the future digital smart economy. So I was asked to try and assess what impact online teaching and learning would have on a South African university in Buffalo City, or the university in Buffalo City, and also to make an assessment of whether the firms there were struggling with the transition to digitization. The most striking thing for me as an anthropologist was to see how the narrative of economic growth in this time of depressed job losses had shifted in this coastal city from one of, there's no industry, what's the auto sector going to do, etc., to a kind of narrative of hope around cables that would connect to the coast from India or Americas, that there was a kind of magical cable economics, a narrative of hope that came through cables, and if only people could acquire certain digital skills, those cables would somewhat miraculously produce jobs, hope, and growth, a kind of newness. And so now I'm trying to get a very complicated story into a few points. So I guess it's quite a long and involved consideration of what I call infrastructural nationalism, which is basically the kind of ideas, not the technologies of infrastructure as much as the ideas people carry about the promise of infrastructure as, and so that what underpins my analysis is the idea that since the end of apartheid, we've really been driven by this promise of suburbia as I suppose the ultimate gift of liberation is to deliver to black South Africans what they had essentially been denied, and that epitomized modernity in the rest of the world was the delivery of suburbia. But unfortunately, it was a kind of sub-suburban replica that wasn't particularly well-resourced. But it led to an obsession with houses and shopping centers. In fact, local economic development was not really about creating productive economy, it was about consuming the kind of things that would fill these houses. And similarly, our imagination of development, both in urban and rural areas, where the state was present, but even where it was absent, if you go to places of the rural Transkei, it is full of suburban homes that have been created on hard-earned migrant income that have very little market value, actually, but they constitute places that have been reconfigured within this imagination. And so I link this then to the idea of, these looted malls that we had, a kind of aspirational desire to shop, and the deepening poverty of the pandemic, and the kind of logicalness of moving from a service delivery protest to a mall invasion. It's all part of the same, bundle of goods that you ultimately are connected to these infrastructural nationalisms. Just let me have a quick. So the smart city is a regime like that as well, just like it has, it is calling for a newness, okay, and it is conceptualized within our environment as a kind of extension of suburbia. So the way in which it has been embedded in our political discourse via State of the Nation addresses, imagining bullet trains and new precincts is really megacities which are at the same time smart cities. And so I'm very worried about that because it externalizes the possibilities of digitization, smartness to our existing cities. And it's exactly the kind of thing the previous speaker, Josh, was talking about, constructing microclusters, actually working the urban space, in his case, the urban value chains, but I would say the urban places for reconstitution. And so I'm probably out of time. Am I? No, 5 minutes, okay. So maybe you can bang on a few slides and deal with imagination. Black Panther's just been released. This transatlantic fascination with technology, super powerful blackness is really, Afrofuturism is a very significant feature of West African imaginations of smartness and the potential of technology in society and Africa. So my book reviews some of these cultural ideas and their power. Next slide. This is out of Lagos, some imaginations, both of the slum and the city reconfigured in these kind of futuristic landscapes. And then the real power of the discourse of smartness, which is really not a discourse of real places as much as a discourse of billboards. People in Kinshasa sit under the billboard. they discuss, well, that looks really interesting, but they wonder whether it will ever come to pass. But politicians are really committed to these ideas because young people want technology and they want votes and they want newness. So if we go down a little bit further, another couple of slides. South Africa has started to embrace this even in the rural coastal areas like Port St. John's and Lanseria, etc. I've talked about infrastructural nationalism. I want to just go back to that previous slide. So in the smart city debate, there are kind of two real positions. The one is that newness is neoliberalism, and the right thing to do in Africa is to embed various infrastructures, including internet and so on, in people's neighborhood for service delivery, and that's really good and democratic and what people want. And that's absolutely fine. But my argument in this book is that Africans want and deserve newness, okay? And we have to produce it. It has to be produced on this continent. It's not okay to say that my shack has a smart meter. We need new precincts, we need new areas, and we need new revitalization. And part of the reason for that is that we live in this society, as many parts of Kenya, other parts of Africa, are a product of settler colonialism. Settler colonialism, or the settler city, is predicated on the elimination of indigeneity. That is that is the basis for it. Civility, Eurocentric civility, was the definition of urbanity under colonialism. Indigeneity was seen as the biggest threat to that thing. And so these cities don't feel comfortable for a lot of people. And this is partly why there is a popular drive, and people don't always understand this, to go beyond the city, to look for something new, something out there. And I want to suggest that we should try and resist that impulse and reconsider. Maybe one more slide and then I'm done. So if you go down to the bottom and further, I won't talk about India, and I won't talk about that, or the performance of our inner cities, or our unemployment crisis. But if you just go to that slide about southern theory and northern cities. So I've just been on a trip around 5 American cities, because I'm actually interested in this thing that Josh was talking about. He's talking about clusters, but in the American system, it's often articulated as anchor strategies, where the places of higher education, eds and meds are seen as nodes around which cultural regeneration is possible. And people often take a very hyper-local view of that. They look at particular blocks or 4 or 5 blocks. And we've had that in South Africa. But I think some of the ones that have been predicated on retail and tourism for culture have just collapsed during the pandemic because there just hasn't been enough traction in those areas. So I think that we need to have another careful look at precincts where there are anchor institutions, whether those are museums or long-standing businesses, or whether they are health care facilities that have long histories in particular places, and see how we can collaborate and develop around those. Because I think that increasingly our higher education institutions in this country are becoming mired in place. It means that they might not even exist in 10 years' time if they can't get clean water, electricity, and basic services. So the whole question around taking place-based context seriously, but not trying to externalize smartness, development, modernity. So I'm saying we need newness. I'm saying that we need to avoid, however intoxicating these images are, of externalizing smartness. We have to internalize it. We have to go with and beyond the democratization of access. And thirdly, or fourthly, we have to try and embrace, even though it is a largely Western manifestation rather than a Southern theory, we have to try and embrace will think about ideas of anchoring, try and Africanize them, and try and, as Josh was saying, evaluate them. I mean, you know, we need to look at all our various places where we have good and strong anchor institutions and see whether they would sustain further investment. So, thank you very much for that.
Thank you very much to Professor Dr. Leslie Banks. Just a quick reminder to everyone, please keep your phones on silent so that we don't disturb the session. And also a reminder that the stuff outside the exhibitionists is for sale. So please make sure that you make your way and support the artists. Our next speaker is Professor Anne McCurson from the University of Minnesota. She'll be talking to us around how we can think about arts and cultural innovation and how we can look at merging community journalism with visual art curation and presentation. So let's give her a warm welcome.
Okay. Super, thank you. Can you hear me? Yes. Before I move into my talk, I just want to say how much I enjoyed the last two talks, and I'd like to take a little bit of issue with the last thing that Leslie said, because we have some really egregious cases in the United States of how these kinds of, this last idea about how to bring development into inner cities has really displaced many, many poor people in both Philadelphia and Atlanta. And one of my former PhD students was a professor at the University of Pennsylvania. Now she's at CUNY in New York. And she wrote a wonderful book called University City, which is all about 3 decades of this effort by 2 universities, University of Pennsylvania and Drexel, to recruit and ground pharmaceutical companies, et cetera, around this area. And she did a tremendous amount of work working with community groups to try to oppose basically just tremendous displacement of the whole, long-term existing African-American community with some collaboration from even people in city government. So I really recommend that to you. And I think I'd love to talk to you about that more. So, okay, I'm giving a short talk here about, and it's a big shift in a way, about arts and culture in urban development and in urban life, really, not development so much. And I'm going to just show a few examples from my work that I've done both nationally and in my city of Minneapolis-St. Paul. Okay, how do I get this to, it must be that way. First of all, I'd just like to say that I've really been studying artists for more than 10 years, almost 20 years. And here are 2 examples of quite long projects that I did, some with my students. One is a study of artist centers, which have been started by people who want to create a space for everybody from, there's a playwright center, there's a writer's loft for writers, there's one for music, there are about 8 or 10 of them, I've been forgetting what they all are. And basically, because our foundations in the Twin Cities supported the efforts of these nonprofit groups to establish these, and to help them use their space and their staff and also the gathering functions of these places as ways to really encourage the development and success of artists. I also did a very wonderful study of Native artists in Minnesota. Minnesota is an unusual state for having a large Native American population, both in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis-St. Paul, but also up north. And one of the amazing things that our state did in the late 1980s is to make a decision that Minnesotans could have casinos, but only Native Americans would be able to own and operate them. And that has made a huge difference. I now live in northern Minnesota near the second largest city, Duluth, and we have a very successful Native American reservation, which has created its own technical and community college, which serves white kids as well as Native kids, and has made a huge difference to the culture of our area. So I had found through the Loft Literary Center an amazing writer who told me about her experience at the Loft Literary Center and how they had decided to have a program where you could be mentored by somebody of your own race or ethnic group or whatever. And she has become a very successful writer as a result of this. So I asked her, this is more than 10 years ago, if she would do a study with me of Native artists in Minnesota and how they came to their art forms, how they succeeded with them, who gave them support, where the opposition was, et cetera. And I have digital copies of both of these that I can give you. There are lots of photographs and lots of analysis in both of them. And that has been just something I really have loved doing. Also, I had, no, I went the wrong way. I had a wonderful experience at the end of the last decade. Well, actually, it would have been 2007 or 8. I was getting ready to retire from my professorship because I had just married an amazing man, and I decided that I could go freelance. And I got a call from the new President Obama appointed head of the National Endowment of the Arts, which is a quite sizable agency, nothing like our National Science Foundation, but it has a lot of money every year. And he contacted a woman who was a philanthropist in New York City and as his vice chair, and she called me up and said, we'd like you to come and have dinner with us in Washington. And of course, a call to serve, I love that. So I went, and they said, we want to do a funding program called Creative Placemaking, in which each project has to be a partnership between at least one public sector agency, local, and one nonprofit arts organization. And it was an amazing effort. I had a graduate student who had just finished, and she and I teamed together. And of course, we said to her, well, you know, we can't really go to all these places in the United States, so we're going to try to do this by telephone. And she said, that's fine, no problem. And we ended up choosing 8 or 10 of these place studies that we did to really showcase all the different things. And I'll just tell one quick story, which I love very much. So one of the cities we looked at was Portland, which was building a new light rail line north out of the city. And one of its engineers got this idea that they were really worried nobody would ride the light rail because it's an automobile city. It's a low-density automobile city. And so he suggested to his team that they use artwork in the stations that they were building as a way of making it attractive and exciting for people. And they were pretty dismissive, but he decided that for a station on the north side, as an example, which was a heavily Japanese American community, that he would, they would hire people to express this Japanese American experience in the station. And the artists that he hired did an amazing job of asking people in the Japanese American community what they wanted the station to say about their culture. And they said, we want you to tell the story of our incarceration in the desert during World War II. And so he did amazing things. He made a huge bronze plaque that told the story from the newspapers of the time of the way that people were being taken out to the desert. And then he also invited the Japanese American community to bring objects that had been part of their experience in the desert, you know, like a little battered trumpet or something like that. And he made a beautiful 3-story sculpture outside of the station. Now, the idea behind all of this is that they were really, and this is why the engineers like this too, they were concerned that there wouldn't be enough ridership on a light rail system in Portland, which had never had one before. But actually, by doing this and doing tailoring each station this way, as you know, in response to what the neighborhood wanted to see the station say about itself as a neighborhood, was very, very successful. So anyway, I could go into the other 16 or so examples that we had in this piece, all of them unique and different from around the United States, and our clients loved it. And then we also Rocco Landesman asked me if I would do an analysis of the content of art, different art forms, music, literature, et cetera, in international trade. So I did that, and I was so pleased that our Department of Commerce decided to use this methodology consistently going forward so that we would be able to see the extent to which arts and culture really were a big part of the American international trade network. So, let's see, where am I going next? I went there. So I'm going to switch now and talk about what I'm doing in my retirement. So I had the house of my grandfather. I went and lived with him and wrote a dissertation many years ago, and I ended up buying the house. And my best friend died, and I ended up marrying her husband, who was just retiring himself from being an outstanding high school math and science and psychology teacher. And so now, and then I decided to, we had an unhappy leadership in our public affairs school at University of Minnesota, so I decided to retire in 2009. There were financial incentives to do that. And I began to do a lot of international travel. I did a Fulbright in the UK, in Glasgow, and went back to Japan, taught with a former student in Korea, and so on and so forth. And then I decided to retire fully and move up and live with my husband in our community up there. So shortly after that, the woman that you're seeing here holding this trophy was the editor of a really important weekly newspaper in our area of northern Minnesota. And it had been bought up by a conservative right-wing family from another state, and they closed our offices and had forced her to commute to Duluth to be, to work from an office. And she decided that she was going to start her own paper. She was going to, and first she researched and got the rights back to the name, the historic name, which is the Pine Knot. It's a wood products city of about 16,000 people. And then she recruited 4 of us to join her as a team. And we each put up $500, which isn't really a whole lot, and really began to discuss what we would do in our issue, which runs about 24 pages every week and is available both online or through mail. And one of the most wonderful things is that we won Best Weekly Newspaper in Minnesota for 2 years in a row. And you can see the size of the trophy. It's really big. And that's at our office. But what I want to really say about how this relates to arts and culture is that we also run a gallery. So we have a beautiful multicolored brick wall that runs the length of our building, kind of a shotgun style building. And one day in our meeting, I was sitting there looking, I said, this wall would make a beautiful art gallery. And they said, who would do that? I said, I would do that. And I had advisors, somebody who had run the Duluth Art Institute, and also a man whose artwork I had bought and who had been a high school teacher. And they really helped me figure out how to do it. And we have a very successful network of regional arts councils in Minnesota, which is funded by, and I won't go into the way it got funded, but it was an unholy alliance of the hunting people and the arts people and the environment people. and it's a big increase in the sales tax for 20 years. So it's generated a lot of money and really infrastructure also, especially on the arts side. So, and here you can see a little bit of our gallery. These are just some people in our gallery. So I already told that part of the story. Oh no, I'm going the wrong way here, aren't I? Okay, sorry. Yeah, So that's the story. So here's an example. Now, also I want to say that the Native American artists in our region have been really amazing. And this is an example, Karen Savage Blue. She teaches at the college, and she does this very fanciful work, which is also very beautiful with many colors. And this is an example of what we do. We always have an opening, and we invite people to come. We offer things to eat and nibble and drink, and then we have an artist talk, and a lot of opportunity for people to answer the Q&A. It really helps sell work, too, by the way, which we do sell. So I'm having a hard time going back and forth there. Sometimes we do themed exhibits. So we did a bird exhibit, and we had 11 people who just entered all these different kinds. Some were actually sculptures of birds in wood, and this is one of my favorite ones called Bird Song by a woman who did not want hers to be offered for sale. And this is another one by another woman who has played a major role in high school education in our community. And also, we have an extraordinary history of Native American artists being successful. And this man is probably one of the 2 or 3 people that started it way back in the 1970s. His name is Carl Gauboy. He's a wonderful watercolor painter, and he, with a couple of other women, started an Ojibwa Traveling Art Expo. And they would travel around Minnesota, often going to colleges, and exhibit their work. And I had interviewed him sitting at his wonderful window here by Lake Superior for our study we had done on Native artists. And we just did an exhibit, a portrait exhibit, and this is a photograph of him working that was by another Native artist in our region, and she offered 5 or 6 of these up for us, which we did very well selling those. Oops, wrong way. And I also, this is my Danish grandfather, and I love the fact that I have people in my life who've created portraits of people in my family, and then after many years of my asking, could I buy it from you, finally agreed to let me do it. So these have been very successful exhibits, and I don't really have time to go into it. If I did, I would go back and explain to you how I shifted from working on industries, and especially the military-industrial complex, and how I came to South Africa and worked with colleagues in Cape Town at the end of apartheid to figure out how we could, retrain the people in the military, and how we could get rid of aircraft carriers that South Africa doesn't really need, et cetera, which was a really wonderful experience. So I have produced many, many different studies. The other wonderful thing that happened to me is after I began to do this writing about arts, I got a call from a really important philanthropist from New York who had just been appointed the #2 person in our National Endowment for the Arts. The head of it, of which is a man who owns 4 theaters on Broadway, has been one of the most wonderful impresarios that we have had in the United States for many years. So she called me up and she said, we'd like you to come to Washington and have dinner with us. And I'm going, oh my gosh, they're going to pitch a project to me, which they did. And they said, we want you to make the case for this creative placemaking. And I said, okay, what is creative placemaking? Okay, our idea, they said, is to have at least one arts organization, and hopefully more, that are very embedded in their neighborhoods, and somebody in a local government agency that will work together, walk out their doors and work together to really think about not just how can we get people into our building and pay for our artworks, but to really make a difference to our neighborhood. And I'll just give you one, well, I already talked about the Portland case. So, and there were many other cases. So one of my graduate students and I spent, and we said, well, we can't do this without, doing research. And Joan Shigekawa said, well, that's fine, but you only have this amount of money. So we couldn't go places. So we had to do it all by phone. So we did about 100 different interviews with prospective possible examples where this was already happening in different places around the U.S. And we ended up with about 11 case studies. And we also, at the chairman's request, I did an analysis of the extent to which artistic goods and services are a part of our national income accounts, which we'd never had before. We had wonderful Bureau of Economic Research analysis of everything, you know, like how much farm produce we sell internationally, and by the time we finished our work, we could show how much artists' work, literature in English books, people who travel to perform in other countries, how big a chunk that was of it was bigger than the farm sector, actually, and we have a big exporting farm sector. So that was very successful. So we did this study, and the team of these two people for the next 4 years went about, you know, soliciting and then funding different projects, and it's been a really, really important change in the way that our national government and local governments fund arts and culture. Because before they just did the really big, you know, the museums, the symphony orchestra, and everything else, and it's really changed the landscape for artists and for their communities. And I think that's probably enough. And we can have some Q&A. And also I want to just add that part of the reason that I began to do this work is because I've been studying industries for many years. I did big studies of the steel industry. I did a lot of work dismantling the Cold War economy and the whole sector. And so I really wanted to shift gears. And so I started thinking, why do we just study industries? Let's study occupations. And I did a tremendous amount of writing for journals and analysis of different occupations, how they were formed, how they performed, you know, what the pay was like, how stable or unstable they were, often again with many of my graduate students. And this is a longer list than this, and if you would like a copy of them, I can just ship it to you, so just let me know. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much to Professor Markussen. Just a reminder as well to our online participants, good morning, we didn't say hello to you for this session, that you can participate in the Miro board. So just a reminder, and you can find the links within the chats online. Now I'm going to invite Mr. Eric Karangera from Afro Groove Rwanda to talk to us about how they've been working around promoting intra-African music touring circuit as a pillar of growth and African music value chain. So just give me one more come.
Hello, good morning, everybody. You can all hear me? Good. So, first of all, thank you for... No, I have no presentation. Yeah, I'm going to tell you a story. So thank you to the organizers, number one, because it's a wonderful opportunity for thinkers, practitioners, and players in the CCI to come together to exchange ideas and to move the needle a little bit further. I'm using the needle as a very deliberately, because my background comes as a DJ. I'm not a researcher, I'm not an academician, I'm not a scholar. I'm a DJ, club DJ, promoter. And I started the DJing like 20 years ago. 20 years ago, we still need the needle, the acetate, the records. So, you know, moving the agenda a little bit further is the opportunity that we have here. And thank you for allowing me to speak and let you know about some of my thinking. So I'd like to plant two ideas and two of my findings after 30 years of like moving around as a DJ, music promoter, and live music promoter. Two findings. The US-based Ivy Business Journal defines the business of culture as the business of designing, producing, distributing, and marketing cultural products. So even though it gives employment to millions, and is main business of many large and small organizations, it is an area that is rarely studied from a strategic management perspective. So that's interesting. And this event, I think, is a testimony of the energy and resources being invested to understand the cultural and creative industry. The current buzzword is creative industries. That's the buzzword. We heard it out, from every session, every day. But, let's take also a look into another buzzword, another expression. Maybe we're going to look into it. is the business of culture. The business of culture. I'll just give you a definition of the business of culture. And as an international DJ and live music promoter, opportunity to experience travel as well as organize travel for third parties are numerous. I travel all over the world. Because of the music, I had the opportunity to go to places that I couldn't ever afford. Just my talent brought me there. And with my activities on the other side of the music industry as a manager and as an organizer, I saw also all the requirement that is needed to organize people to travel and cultural tourism, understanding all the different players, and give you a very, inside look on how all the value chain of cultural tourism is working. So I'd like to take a pause and talk about cultural tourism. This is the second idea I'd like to plant into your head. By 2030, consumer spending in hospitality and leisure in Africa is expected to reach approximately $261.77 billion. This is a research done by Birken Research Institute. I'd like you to take a pause and think about that number. $261 billion. This is what they predicted for the cultural tourism in Africa. So what are the benefits of cultural tourism? There are many. So we have first the intangible ones, intangible benefit of cultural tourism. It's the conservation of cultural and artistic heritage, local prosperity for non-traditional tourism destination, and the establishment of links between different cultures. I'm going to tell you a little story. In Rwanda, we have creative entrepreneurs who organize photographic tours, village lifestyle experience, where the tourism take them to villages to learn about pottery, to learn about basket making, to learn about craft, to learn about drumming, to learn about dancing. And those guys are working by themselves. The information about the experience that they offer to the tourism is not on official platforms. Those are initiatives as creative entrepreneurs that they do by themselves. So there's no template for cultural tourism in the official advertising of tourism experience in our country. Those Rwandan guys are acting by themselves. They set up their own platform, they do their own advertising, they do their own package, they've got no support, no sponsors, no fundings. It's just the ideas. Those are creative, photographers, dancers, drummers, who find ways to engage with people traveling to their own country and want to know more about the territory which they come to. Those people coming to the country, they find it difficult to find this information, but those guys are acting on themselves as creative entrepreneurs, their own resources. So I could ask the audience, I come from Rwanda, I could ask you, if you have to come to my country, what are the things that you would want to do? What are the things that you are aware of? I put the question out to you. Yes?
If you can use your desk mics, everyone. They work. It's like being in the United Nations. So if you press the green button...
She was talking about the cleanliness. She was talking about the cleanliness. So, and the? Kindness. Exactly, kindness. That's what she knows about Rwanda. Is there somebody else who knows anything about Rwanda? If you had to come to Rwanda, what would be the first thing that you want to do?
See the gorillas.
See the gorillas. Yes. Highly advertised, I have to say. This is one of the main strategies of the tourism in Rwanda. We have something called MICE in Rwanda. It's a meeting, incentive, conference, and event. So Rwanda has situated itself as a leader on the continent for conferences. But at the same time, we have three things that people want to see when they come to Rwanda. They want to go to see the gorillas. We push people to go and check out what's going on with the genocide and the history of us, but that's something a bit gloomy. Not everybody wants to do that. They want to do things that are fun, things that galvanize them. They want to play with their emotion. It's about their feeling. It's about their memories. It's about discoveries. It's about exchanges. And let's not neglect, when we talk about cultural tourism, let's not neglect, which is important, I think, the impact on the economy and on jobs. Let's think again about that number, $261 billion. is projected for 2030 for the cultural tourism on the continent. So how do they find those figures? Second thought. A study commissioned by the French Ministry of Economy, Finance and Enterprise concluded that some tools seem to have been developed by universities, laboratories and researchers, maybe observatories too, but they remain unknown and not easily accessible. So we have that big numbers that galvanize industry to give that wonderful pictures of what tourism, cultural tourism could be for the continent, how it could benefit for the continent, but we don't really know how do they calculate those numbers. So in my experience as a DJ spanning 3 decades, we find that our prediction of an explosion of cultural tourism in Africa as an economic sector still little understood. It's informal, it's underexploited, and it lacks serious and long-lasting investment. So we plan to make a lot of money, but we don't really know how we're going to do this. So my experience with skepticism, stereotype that, my experience with skepticism, I need to tell you about my experience. It's 1999. I went to London, and my observation of the cultural scene in London was that the enthusiasm for black experience and black culture was really directed towards the States and towards the Caribbean. So we have a city in London that is like largely known as the head city of club culture. People travel from far away to experience clubbing in the UK. And black music has a very high position in that market. But all that expression of black culture is really directed toward the Caribbean and the America. Little is known about Africa. As a DJ practicing black music on the dance floor, I can already observe, I can sense, I can read the room, and I'm trying to experiment already to just bring some African sound, traditional sound, African hip-hop. Music is produced by the young, vibrant African youth that hasn't reached the mainstream market, but it exists on the continent. So my role was to be a vessel of Africanness expression, musical expression of the youth, vibrant, urban Africa. We all know the numbers of Africa, we all know the demographic, we all know that 60% of Africa is under 25 years old. So that's the future of Africa, who's producing cultural products, and the head city of club culture is not paying attention. So I was the vessel to put that towards the consumers and let them know about what's going on in Africa. So from my vantage point, I could see that there's a vision, something's going to shift in how we perceive Africa. And I was hindered and challenged by everybody that I approached, because Africa was known for the corruption, Africa was known for insecurity, Africa was known for lack of seriousness, Africa was known for lack of infrastructure, and all the responsibility of developing the continent and developing the cultural tourism was fall onto Africa. And my colleagues and the people I approached, record label, marketing managers, agents, funding organization, to let them know that the trend, the way I read the room from the dance floor, I can see that there's a trend that's going to shift towards Africa. That was 1999, 2000. That's what I created Afro Groove, my network. So if you fast forward to 2022, we can see that what we observe from the dance floor, from the intimacy of the dance floor, is quite relevant. When you look at the numbers, when you look at the numbers of sale and streaming of African artists today compared to 20 years ago, they are much higher. Those African artists, usually when they tour, when they do their touring and their promotion, they promote their product in the Western side. It's America, it's Europe, and rarely they're touring the African continent. There's a lot of risk involved, there's a lack of seriousness, and the number one hinders is the exorbitant price of traveling between cities in Africa. My experience about touring is very relevant. In 2005, I participated to a festival called Lake of Stars in Malawi. Lake of Stars was organized by a UK promoter who discovered the lake in Malawi, the Lake Malawi, it's called the Lake Malawi, and decided to set up a festival in that lake. The first edition, I think, brought over 600 people in that festival, and there was like 20% of them, they were coming from the UK. There was his friend. They traveled all the way from the UK, from Norway. There was his sound engineer was from the Norway, and they all traveled, to Malawi together. The year after, he managed to secure a sponsorship deal with Kenyan Airways. Kenyan Airways allocated them a massive discount for group booking, plus allocated a few tickets for key players of that festival. That means that when I took that plane, Kenyan Airways, from London to travel to that festival, we were 30 people in that plane. 30 people in that plane. So Kenyan Airways was a big supporters of the mobility of artists and audiences to experience to have that cultural experience. At the same time, there was also the rise of budget airlines in Europe. EasyJet. EasyJet allowed me to go to places I'd never been before, allowed me to travel with a crew of people when I was booked in different countries like Greece or Denmark, Sweden, Italy, Spain. We could find a ticket to travel to any cities of Europe for less than $100. If you book your ticket early with EasyJet, you can travel all across Europe. I know that some of you must know about that, but that really helped the mobility of people, the mobility of artists, the mobility of creative entrepreneurs also were able to set up operation in a different city. For example, Croatia. I had a friend of mine who was in Croatia. He was based in the UK, promoting the UK, was booked and commissioned by the city of Croatia to organize a festival in that city. She had all the network of all the artists she knew how to promote. She set up a holiday camp festival in Croatia around the lake at a time when the country was in desperate need of increasing the tourism influx. It has been very successful. I don't have the numbers here, but if you look at Croatia tourism numbers, they really spiked. It had a significant contribution in elevating awareness about the sexiness of a country like Croatia. If you have to go on holiday, I don't think that at that time, in the 2000, if you had to go on holiday, Croatia was not coming on top of mind. But somehow they managed to make the destination a little bit sexy, interesting, and joyful and trendy, culturally relevant. People can go there, observe the culture, and also participate and network amongst their own people, exchange with the local crowd around the common experience, which is music. I'm going to tell you a story about the exorbitant price of organizing intra-African touring on the continent. I'll put you a question forward. I set up a program called Azot. Azot it's African Sounds on Tour. African Sounds on Tour managed to secure some fundings from Pro Helvetia in Switzerland and to organize a tour for an up-and-coming artist. That artist was traveling with a 5-piece band, did 5 cities, Goma, Kigali, Dar es Salaam, Nairobi, and Zanzibar 2. And I'm going to get back to it in a moment, but I'd like for you to just try to, according to your own experience, to just try to imagine the costs of organizing a travel for 5-piece band, 5 people, for 6 artists traveling across 5 cities, organizing a tour when each city they've got an audience, a venue, and they can get paid. I'm going to come back to it in a moment. But the finding of verbal exchange with colleagues and personal experience revealed that the main hindrance to the growth in intra-African travel is the exorbitant price and scarcity of direct routes between the cities. We were able to manage that tour for 5 cities with 16 $16,000. $16,000 managed to take all that crew to make them travel. I know some colleagues and promoters, organizers, when they need to bring an international artist to perform in their cities in Africa, in any country of Africa, whether we're talking about East Africa, West Africa, South Africa, maybe there's some music promoters here that can tell me if those numbers make sense, but to tour an artist coming from Europe for one date, just for one, let's not talk even talking about tour, let's talk about one date. They situate the numbers, the ballpark numbers, between $15,000 and $20,000 to be able to bring a band, pay for the per diem, their accommodation, then transportation, local transportation, international transportation, pay them a fee, promote the event, hire the venue. That's the cost that it has for one date. And with the same number, we were able to do 5-date tour. So that was just thanks to the support of a cultural organization, Pro Helvetia from Switzerland, that we were able to do that. But it also challenged the idea that touring African artists, touring within the continent, it's expensive. You can cut the numbers, you can collaborate. I was working with an artist that is up and coming, so we were able to find like a business model where each promoters in each cities, the funds that I had just allowed me to bring the artist at the airport. And then the promoters can take charge and pay them their fee. So it was a minimum cost. We managed to do everything like that at that price. But that's just like, it's a testimony of the collaboration, how the power of collaboration, where all the hindrance of promoting music or promoting event or promoting platform here in Africa, it doesn't have to fall all on the shoulder of the promoter. So some numbers, report reading teaches that over 55% of the average tourist spending is towards logistic, to the height of 17%. Accommodation, to the height of 14%. Internal transport, 27%. And 18% is spent on food and beverage, recreation, tourism, and cultural products. In Rwanda, they kind of estimate the daily spending of tourism at $200. Maybe you have some numbers, I don't know, but this is the numbers that we have. So with interview with the government officials, private sectors, insiders, and marketing, managers highlight the challenge, the lack of clear cultural tourism policy, and institutional bottleneck, red tape, to implement the innovative measure required to create a fluid ecosystem in the interdependent component of the tourism industry and the value chain of tourism and CCI. Music festivals benefit a whole chain of shareholders. However, even producers, music promoters, and festival organizers still struggle on their own financing their activities. We could do much more if we were working together as long-term partners with long-term, tangible objective towards influencing consumers' habits. So across the continent, creative artists and cultural operators' incomes, investment, economic opportunities, and revenues are increasingly dependent on foreign government cultural institutions, such as Institut Français, Goethe Institute, British Council. We find it very difficult to find like support. Because of time, I'm gonna wrap it up. But the pressure to perform, the pressure to convince, the pressure to generate revenue hinders on our shoulders as organizers. So this talk is there's a deficit of intra-cultural exchange and experience, knowledge about each other and culture on the continent. Festival network and promoters alliances trying to change this. Limited regional circuits, limited access to funds, risk-averse public sector. Those are the constant challenges that we have. So this is a call to make a case to access to grants, to access to loans, investment, and the collaboration for the design of a sponsorship package from players in the tourism value chain and hospitality and airlines industry that would usually help tide over the cost of event manager amongst all shareholders who are benefiting from the vibrant cultural tourism industry. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric, for quite wonderful insights in terms of how we can look at increasing and sort of collaboration amongst our African brothers and sisters. Our final speaker today is Ms. Maria Paula McGurk from the British Council, who will be talking to us about how the business development landscape and shifts in South Africa. So let's give her a warm welcome. Thank you.
Morning, everyone. I'm Maria Paula McGurk. I'm an independent researcher, a consultant, and a practicing visual artist. Earlier this year, I was contracted by Business and Arts South Africa and the British Council to do some research on the funding landscape of South Africa, with specific look at shifts in themes and approach. I've only got 20 minutes, and in 20 minutes I cannot give all the insights into the reports. So I'm going to just focus on key points, but the report will be made available for anyone who's interested in reading the comprehensive findings. So introduction. The COVID pandemic, whether by choice or force, has offered organizations and government entities an opportunity to reevaluate their approach, priorities, and focal areas for internal and external developments. Within the creative economy of South Africa, this re-evaluation has led to thematic shifts and developments, as well as the questioning of how the funding landscape functions and how we can make the sector more sustainable for all. Some facts about the research. It was 6 weeks from contract to final submission, so it's a very short research project. Majority of it was done by desktop research with 12 interviews. The interviews were from art practitioners, art organizations, institutions, and governments. The limitations of the research, obviously time. There's a need for further comprehensive developments of the research. A big challenge of this type of research is that funding within the creative economy is difficult to quantify. There are a lot of partnerships, a lot of relationships, and a lot of funding that is given that is not online as a funding entity giving funding. It's developed through relationships and partnerships. Limited stakeholder engagement. There should be more engagement within the stakeholders that are engaged with, and then other sections, other groups, such as corporates, embassies, government entities on a national, local, and provincial level, educators, and then, of course, arts organizations and practitioners nationally. So for this research, I used the cultural trident. I really like the breakdown of the different categories and seeing the creative economy as an umbrella term that encompasses all elements that are happening within the creative and cultural industries. For this research, there's A and C, not A and C, A and C, which is cultural occupations in the cultural industries and non-cultural occupations within the cultural industries. Of course, the focal area is the cultural and creative industries for the funding landscape. Yesterday, there was quite a lot of conversation about different forms of research, qualitative versus quantitative. I find that through the qualitative research, the quantitative research makes more sense, and it gives you an angle of and direction of how to interpret and analyze the research. So interviews to me are very, very important, and it was through the interviews that I started analyzing the desktop research. The following few slides are just going to show key findings from the people and the organizations that were interviewed. Firstly, key changes within the creative economy in South Africa from the perspective of the interviewees. Some of these are very obvious, but sometimes it's useful to see them in an infographic to point out which are new and which are developed from before COVID experiences. The one that stood out for me, and anyone who was in the South African landscape in the creative and cultural industries for the last 2 or 3 years will know, is the loss of trust in the system. There was a lot of fight back from arts practitioners to funding organizations. They were challenging them on a range of issues, when funding is allocated, who funding is allocated to, what the internal costs of an organization are that are giving funding. And this led, from my perspective, led quite strongly to a can-do attitude from arts practitioners and a re-questioning of how and why we function within the creative economy and how we could become less dependent on the sector, on funding, in essence. Did it move? Huh? Wait, I think it's... wait, sorry, let me just... Okay. What re-evaluations could fund-based organizations shift for receiving funds? So this is for people looking for funding, and these were the key points. Think like a business. Look outside the arts and culture sector. Asset-based approach. What do we have and what can we create? And lastly, grow projects that already exist. What re-evaluation could fund-based organizations shift for giving funding? There are quite a few interesting ones. The one that always makes me smile is listen to artists. If only government would listen to artists, we would have a lot more solutions. And in essence, what that is implying is that artists and practitioners need to stop being seen as the end result, and they need to join the discussions in the boardroom. They need to be part of the strategic decisions being made in order for them to be relevant to what's happening on the ground. You cannot make the solutions from a top-down approach. You have to plug in on the ground, which means artists have to be part of those conversations on a very serious level. Other key elements: be realistic. How far can the funding you're offering go? Be realistic to what's achievable, so something good can be done, even if it's small. Support, but not through finance. It was very interesting because I expected to hear that from creative organizations, but not from arts practitioners. And I heard that from both the arts practitioners, from 3 of the arts practitioners that were interviewed, that the funding, the idea of continually giving money to projects is creating a sense of dependency. Well, it exists. A sense of dependency exists. And artists realized during COVID-19 that that's not viable and it can't work. So how else could funding be given that can have a much longer-term impact on the sector at large, as well as the arts practitioners? The last one I want to speak to is suppliers rather than funding. This also came up from artists as well as arts organizations. What this is implying is that all of these corporates that are funding organizations, all government institutions and departments who want to support the growth of the creative economy, they can do so in different ways. And one of those ways, it's not the only way, but one of those ways is to have suppliers on their database that are from the micro-creative entrepreneurship sector. So instead of going for the very big companies as your suppliers, get your artworks in your offices, all original artworks. You know what an impact that would have on the visual arts sector? Have original artworks in your company and your government departments. Buy those works. It's not funding, it's buying. And it's allowing for an element of pride in creatives. And that pride gives them this sense of push. And it also has a positive impact on the mental state that we're seeing in the creative economy. It's with artworks, services like design services, architectural services, performers, poets. All of these elements should be on your supplier database. And in order to make that realistic, arts organizations, the middle band, become very important to make sure that arts organizations are compliant with becoming suppliers. Thematic shifts since 2020. Some of these are very evident: entrepreneurship, income generation, climate change, inclusivity, mental health and well-being, the Ukrainian war, COVID relief funding and its impact on the sector. So key findings in thematic shifts. From the desktop research and the interviews, there were three key elements that kept on popping up. These are South African trends and global trends. The first is entrepreneurship and job creation. Governments and corporates are shifting their focus very strongly in this area. Climate change, opportunities for social and educational impact. And finally, fourth industrial revolution and digital developments. The last one is one that lots of cultural and creative industry people kind of shy away from, not realizing there's lots of ways that we work that are already showing the impact of 4IR. The one that I've pointed out here is the shift in how we work. The first industrial revolution was a centralized network. You had key big organizations and everything fed into that. Where we are now is a just distributed network. A simple example of that is websites, or the web, where there is no hierarchy. It's a flat model, and there's lots of nodal points and moments of connection between us. The creative economy has been working like this for years. And it's not just in the creative economy that this way of working is starting to shift. It's happening in all industries. The creative economy has an opportunity to show other industries what that actually means, because that's how we work in many ways. When it comes to engaging with government, we are forced to go back to the old-fashioned centralized network. But when we work with each other, we have the flat model. The arts and culture sector no longer has to remain within its silo, and it is through a re-evaluation of its role and approach that the real opportunities will open up for collaboration and partnership. Yesterday there was quite a bit of conversation, which I've had many times in debates, about the term the creative economy. Lots of people don't like creativity or culture and economy to be associated with each other. They think it undermines the value of the sector. I have a bit of a different perspective on that. In my mind, having creativity and economy forged together offers an opportunity to reevaluate what economy is, rather than what culture and creativity are. We are not the only ones challenging society and challenging how we see economy and how we see value within our society. It's happening in the circular economy, the well-being economy, the social economy. All of these terms are challenging what we see and how we see things. And to me, the idea of the creative economy allows us to be part of those very, very important conversations for where our future goes and what we prioritize. So key recommendations for giving and receiving funding. Lots of people just want a list. They want to know where can we get funding and how can we make our business sustainable. The truth is it's up to you. And what is needed is a shift in thinking. Once the shift in thinking comes, the opportunities will open up. But it's up to you to start the shift in thinking. I'm going to read through these so that I stay on point, what the key points on these are. Number one, let me wait. Number one, partnership is key. Wait, sorry. Budgets are being cut. Human resource capacity is being stretched to its limits. And organizations, government departments, and institutions are facing one global or local crisis after another. People are tired, anxious, overwhelmed. Many are close to burnout, but also very aware that there is important work to be done to contribute positively to the reality we all face. Partnership is what is needed, and on a much more substantial and impactful way than ever before. Every organization needs to see their role from a bird's eye view. How do they fit into the larger picture of building a better and more sustainable creative economy in South Africa? Who can they help, and who can help them to make sure that their role and objectives are fulfilled? This way of thinking forces everyone to stop working within their silo or have light partnerships and start to think as a collective with the same objectives to grow and develop the creative economy. We're all on the same mission here. We need to partner more comprehensively with each other. Through considered partnerships, organizations can elevate their work, their capacity, and their impact while achieving the same for the partner organization. There are different strengths that can be brought together and allow for long-term impact and development. Number 2, think entrepreneurially. There are many challenges to the idea of intrapreneurship. Intrapreneurship, I can't even say the word. Intrapreneurship is the idea of introducing intrapreneurship within large institutions and organizations. But there are certain elements of entrepreneurial thinking that are viable and possible to implement. Intrapreneurs see problems as potential solutions and opportunities. No, they see problems as potential opportunities. Opportunities for growth, for change, for experimentation. This way of thinking makes one open to changes and enables one to have the flexibility to act according to those changes. An entrepreneurial way of thinking is a way of thinking which harnesses what you have: passions, skills, experiences of the team, resources internally and externally. People working within an established organization and government have many components which are taken for granted. And an awareness of this reality can offer an opportunity to push forward. For example, if one works within an established organization, the following areas are not a concern, but are a priority for micro-entrepreneurs: salary, building, water and lights, an annual budget, no matter how small, and a team, no matter how small, a legacy, existing projects, a website, research, established local and international networks, etc. The entrepreneur must first create the foundation to cover all of these elements before anything else. With a shift in mindset, employees of larger and established organizations would see their position as a position of privilege and with a springboard to jump from. It is in that place that entrepreneurial thinking could benefit organizations. How can we take what we have and make the most impact within our focal areas? Third, start with what you have, leading from entrepreneurial thinking. It seems to be a valuable action, a favorable action, to start new projects annually, create new partnerships, create new projects, have new exciting content to promote. However, this seems to be a possible waste of what already exists. Before strategizing big changes to move with the times, it would make more sense to intensely analyze what already exists and consider how those programs could be enhanced to have a greater impact. Existing partnerships and existing programs are where one needs to start and look at them once again through a bird's eye view. One should start by considering how this program could reach further, have a larger impact, create new partnerships and financial and in-kind support. How could the beneficiaries be pushed further and gain ongoing support and development? Fourth, long-term thinking and vision. I don't know if he's here today, but I'm going to quote him. Professor of Cultural Economy Andy Pratt points out that nearly every nation-state is now pursuing creative economy strategies. There are many challenges, including the barrier of work patterns and approach of the creative economy, which does not work with generic industrial policies. In her report titled Creative Economy as a Development Strategy, a View of Developing Countries, Rees points out that the development of the creative economy is the introduction of a new economic cycle, one that challenges the status quo and thrives for a well-being economy that is socio-economically inclusive. There is a huge opportunity in South Africa for the creative economy to play a role in offering alternative approaches to how we work and where our focus lies, while having a positive economic impact. For this to be realized, there is a great need for more research and for established organizations within the creative economy to be engaged outside of their silo. The projects and programs offered must feed into a bigger picture that explore the flat model of the Fourth Industrial Revolution, with many nodal points working together, but independently. There is a great need for organizations who have a clear understanding of the creative economy to share their knowledge, and with a larger audience, and from other industries and governments. Finally, look outside the arts and culture sector. In a recent report written by Deloitte and commissioned by Netflix, it is found that the creative economy is large and growing faster than the wider economy. The creative economy is becoming one of the drivers and key sectors in contributing to the growth of economies and employment. This leads to an opportunity for organizations, institutions and government working within the creative economy to develop partnerships with sectors and industries not usually associated with the creative and cultural industries. Two of the people interviewed, or two of the organizations interviewed, saw a growth in their organizations between 2019 and 2022. The growth of the organizations was achieved through the development of partnerships outside the traditional funding offered within the arts and culture sector. So in conclusion, many of the changes we're seeing are not surprising. All that's happened with COVID-19 is that it's enhanced, some of those changes have become highlighted and the shift is happening faster. There is a strong shift away from funding dependency to partnership and income generation. Silo thinking, funding dependency and project-based approaches are being challenged. The potential of the creative economy is a focal point of governments around the world. There is an opportunity for the creative and cultural industries to navigate new terrain and forge new opportunities, but it is dependent on an entrepreneurial way of thinking, where the opportunities need to be present to the potential client or partner. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Maria Paula and to the rest of our speakers. This is the point in which I get off the bus and hand over to my co-chair, Johnny Muteba. I think the thread that has been running through the presentations offers an opportunity for him to share a little bit about the work that he's been doing with the American Art Chamber, as there's also been work focusing on cities. So I would like him to just give us a little bit about that, as well as then he will handle the summary and question and answers. Thank you very much. Let's give him a warm welcome.
All right, thank you so much for this opportunity, Emmy. Thank you for the invitation to engage. I attended the conference in PE in 2018, so I still have the memories from that amazing conference. So I am in the creative space. I am a recovering artist, so I left the arts 6 years ago because I wasn't really making money. So I went to look for money, and I think I kind of have money now. So that's why I'm back in the arts, but working at a global level to bridge the gap between commerce, community, and creativity. So I've worked with a lot of creatives. I was part of Arterial Network South Africa. This was about 12 years ago. But what is very, very important for me is just what came out of every single panelist here today. I've been working with chambers of commerce from 2010. I started my journey in that space with the French South African Chamber. I'm originally from the DRC, so Eric over there is my neighbor. And I've basically spent about 21 years in South Africa. So from last year, I started working in the US in the space of, creating the synergy or the partnership between the private sector and the creative sector. So I set up this Chamber of Commerce in 2020, but before that, I set up the Pan-African Chamber of Commerce. So the Pan-African Chamber is a confederation of chambers of commerce in Africa, industry networks, but also professional associations. The mandate for the chamber really is to ignite a socioeconomic transformation in Africa through innovation, creativity, and entrepreneurship. The conversations that we've been having since yesterday are very affirming for me. As a creative, as a person who's actually just coming back now, but what is standing out for me with all of these conversations is the power of collaborations. There is an African proverb that says, it takes a village to raise a child. So if you've never been to a village, maybe you'll not understand. But I need to just give you an example. So if your neighbor sees your child misbehaving and you are not there, they actually have the liberty and the freedom to give that child a serious beating. So that is the understanding of the village concept. But it's not just that. When you are not around, you are not able to provide for your child, and your child is hungry, a neighbor can also provide for that child. This, according to me, I believe, is something that we can also apply within the creative sector. Yesterday, we had a conversation around young women being left out, right? And we have young people being left out. We've seen movies like the Titanic, they will say women and children first. And we know with the pandemic that women are disproportionately affected. They had to stay at home, they had work, so the burden was actually, I think, heavier on women than on men, who were maybe sitting, watching Netflix, and the responsibility and tired of running the family and running businesses was on women. So are we privileging women and children in this space? That's the question that we need to ask ourselves. So right from the beginning, Dr. Joshua was talking about creative clusters, and something that stood out for me there is the partnership or the relationship between academia, innovation, access to capital. He was talking about life cycle of creative clusters, and of course, evaluation. Dr. Leslie was talking about, the book, COVID and Custom in Rural South Africa, culture, healthcare, and the state. He was talking about cities being left behind by technology, and there was this concept of newness, and I was actually very much interested in trying to understand if we are thinking differently. So are we going to just stop at thinking, or we now need to move to applying or doing? I don't think we just need to stand with that possibility of thinking. We can also move to the doing part. And Prof. N was speaking about creative placemaking, and just in the definition alone, you will see why this concept of the village I spoke about earlier on is so important in this, where creative placemaking here is about partners from the public, the private, the non-profit community sectors, strategically shaping the physical and social characters of a neighborhood, of a town, a reservation, city or region, with arts and culture activity at its core. So you see here that you cannot do this on your own. The silo mindset, the silo mentality that we've been talking about over the last 2 days is something that we see happening as well. The reason why I set up this Arts Chamber of Commerce, because of my experience with other chambers, the French Chamber primarily. When you work with the French Chamber, because it's part of the European Union, you work with the Germans, you work with the Dutch, you work with the British. This was before Brexit, of course. And what you realize is that they don't have a space for culture. I remember speaking to the French Chamber of Commerce. I was a member, this was since 2010, about a film exchange program, or a music exchange program, or a fashion show with South African designers. France and South Africa work very well. In fact, South Africa is France's biggest trading partner in Africa. What I was told by the chamber was that you need to go to Alliance Française, or you need to go to the French Institute of South Africa, because here, chambers don't do those things. I engaged the British Chamber of Commerce in Southern Africa. They sent me to the British Council. The British Council is here. They're organizing this little meetup tonight, so maybe I'll also ask them that question. The German Chamber, the same conversation. You need to go to the Goethe Institute, because that's where culture is supposed to be. I saw this gap in the marketplace since 2010, and I realized that there's a need for an art chamber of commerce, because you cannot just have art, you need commerce as you are creating. And I know creatives who are very, very selfish. We close ourselves in our little corners, and we don't really look at what's happening outside. So you finish writing a book, you finish making your music or putting a film together, where are you going to sell those things? So I knew that internationally there was a need for something like this. But being an African, I understand the continent. I know that in Africa we don't really value art that much. So I set it up to bridge the gap between commerce, community, and creativity at a global level, not just promoting American culture in Africa, but promoting African culture as well in the US and across the globe. Eric spoke about the business of culture, and the numbers here for me are very interesting. So the year is 2030. We have the Sustainable Development Agenda. Globally, we have the African Agenda with the African Union. We have the African Free Continental Trade area as an opportunity. Eric, we need to speak more about that. But just how difficult it is to travel within the African continent. So what needs to be done here, I think, is the partnership with the private sector. You spoke about Kenyan Airways, which is, of course, a state entity, bringing sponsors for Lake of Stars in Malawi, but also just seeing how European institutions are supporting culture in Africa. We need African institutions. We need African philanthropists. We need African money to support African culture in Africa. So that's something that I think we need to do. And lastly, Maria Paula was talking about the funding landscape in South Africa, the loss of trust in the system, less funding opportunities, mental health, digital prevalence, but also around entrepreneurship and job creation, climate change, 4IR, and the digital development. Entrepreneurship is a French word, so if you literally want to understand, it comes from a word called entreprendre. So to entreprendre means to undertake. So if you divide that word into two, E-N-T-R, that is to enter, entree. So you enter. And prendre means you are taking something. So an entrepreneur is a person who gets in to take something out. Maybe that can be an opportunity or opening doors for other people as well. And I think creatives have not really thought about that mindset. That needs to change as well. As Dr. Leslie was talking about this newness. Partnership is key. Think entrepreneurially, start with what you have, not just what you have. You need to start with where you are, because I believe where you stand determines what you see. Long-term thinking really is very, very important here. Look outside the arts and culture sector. So that is kind of my understanding of the discussions we've had today and also, of course, yesterday. We are now going to move to the Q&A session. As you know, you can just click the button in front of you. You can address the questions to the panelists here in the room, but you can also address the professor who's online, I think in the UK. Yeah, that's basically all from me for now. Do we have questions in the audience? There's a question here. How many, this side, I want to start with this side first. There's a question at the back. Can we start with you in front here, and who are you addressing a question to?
Thank you, Program Director. My name is Noma Xabiso Mahlawe from Kids Pass. I want to appreciate this forum so much, the department and the observatory, for bringing together the people, especially in the light of everything that has happened. I just want to highlight a key thing that came up, especially yesterday and today, that is of interest to what I'm doing as an artist. I'm an ordinary artist, independent producer, but I'm also an educator for kids. Eric mentioned that 60% of we all know that around 60% of the people in populations in Africa is the youth. And therefore, it means that we need to really take seriously with the kinds of things that we do in these kinds of forums. And I appreciate the fact that there's government here, there are donor organizations, and then even though she said we need to start not relying so much on funding, but I appreciate that. There is a concept that came up yesterday from one of the speakers about everyday economy. I represent and founded an organization called Umzilakando Family Foundation, and we have a program where we're going to create a family history gallery. It came up from Professor Makuzen. I appreciate you also, because I was a town planner at some stage, and we read a lot of your work. About how we can use the creativity in our families. That's an everyday economy. And it's something that we can tap into. Now, with respect to the people that are here, a lot of policies in government, in terms of funding, they have a clause where they say we don't fund family organizations. I trust that out of these kinds of conversation, some things like those have to be looked at and interrogated, and look at whether it's relevant to say we don't fund family organizations when there's an everyday economy out there that people are living on, and they are thriving on, and they can create family empires on. The second thing that I wanted to highlight is that from the work that I'm doing on cultural tourism, there's a point that came about. We must start where we are, and we must start with what we have. Eric illustrated a case study, a very good case study of doing with what you have, going to the tourism thing. Our organization was invited to a film market in France about 2 weeks ago, and there was, I think, a couple from Nigeria and ourselves, and there is a lot of opportunity there. And the South African who was supposed
Can you please wrap up?
Yes.
Is
so
this just
what I'm
a
trying
comment or
to say,
expression?
what I'm trying to say is that I appreciate so much, and I trust that the observatory will take whatever we're having here that is debatable and negotiations and theoretical, and make it practical for artists. Because there were sit-ins last year and debates about how the department is handling artists. This is the opportunity for us to talk about these things and to change some of these things and to make it work for artists and to work for the economy as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was a comment. Can we please make our questions very, very short and straight to the point? So I will go to the lady at the back. I will come back to you. The lady in black here. This was not a question. So if you would like to reflect on that, I think, or we can leave it at that. The lady at the back, and then the one here from, I think, the British Council at the back.
All right, good morning, everyone. I'm not too sure if this is working, but I hope it is. My name is Tshwane from the National Department of Sport, Arts and Culture, and I'm responsible for social cohesion, nation building, and target groups. Actually, for me, it's
Your microphone is not on.
I'm trying to switch it on, so I'm not too sure.
Oh, there. Yeah, please speak. Yeah, come closer.
All right. Yes, and I wanted to say that for me it's a comment as well, but I'll make it quick in relation to the presentation that was made by Professor Banks on COVID and custom. And it just made me start to think, and I hope the room can think about it as well, the issue around the barrier of rights. To say that perhaps it's because our history is not quite written and was not written by us, and also maybe our culture, tradition, and custom is not codified, and perhaps I would like to have his views on that. Because when I think about it, in terms of the burial rights, not to say that it's right for people to have been buried in plastic, but we'll remember that as Africans, how we buried is to have a cowhide sewn around you, which is why we still have the pressure of having these huge funerals today, because we originally would slaughter a cow so that you could be buried. And later on, when that was not affordable, then we moved to a blanket, and a simple blanket, not the twin that we have now. So I think perhaps just in terms of the people in the communities and the transition and maybe the change of culture and custom, if there was that understanding to say that actually originally that's how we used to bury. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. Led from the British Council.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Grace Meadows, and yes, I am from the British Council. So, Chair, we look very forward to engaging with you and all of the delegates later on this afternoon. It's been such a great privilege to be able to contribute to some of the panel. So, undoubtedly, my question goes for Maria Paula. Thank you so much for articulating, I think, something that has been very complex and really hard to access and understand, particularly from creatives, which is the funding landscape. I was also really encouraged to see that the research was really made accessible and also was quite honest and forthright with looking at some of the limitations, some being time and other aspects. So my question to you is, now that you've gotten kind of this desktop research down and solid, where do you think is the next steps for both the research to look into? So I think the recommendations you made were really practical, and thank you for that. Where do you see this going?
Oh, there we go. Hello. You know, my dream would be that all research is made public, number one. That anyone wanting to get insights into how things, how they could learn and grow within their organization as arts practitioners can access the information. It's not enough to publicize it as an academic paper, because only academics will read it. Nobody's going to go through a 60-page document page by page unless you're an academic or a researcher. So the information has to be shared in a way that is accessible to people on the ground, and also in a way that they can challenge it. You know, we assume that what academics and researchers give us is facts, and it's not, it's perceptions. You know, there were many ways that my research could have gone. Obviously, I colour it with my views of the creative economy, and that's really important to know, you know, that these are not facts. It's just analyses from different perspectives, and a robust creative economy will be one where there's difference of opinion, and there's debate, and there's discussion. But in order to get artists, and you know, when I say artists, I mean arts practitioners, I mean the full stream of people involved on the ground in micro businesses. In order to get their voices heard, we have to find new approaches of how we engage, and that would include platforms that aren't conferences, platforms that are brainstorming sessions and getting down there and engaging with the information. So number one to me would be that, and number two would be that arts organizations like the British Council and Business and Arts South Africa and government really start hearing what's being said and start evaluating internally how they could start making shifts that would be relevant to themselves and their relevance within the sector, as well as to the arts practitioner. Because if they did that, it would build, it could potentially change this negative atmosphere that currently exists and build a deep level of respect from arts practitioners to arts organizations and to governments, instead of being intimidated by what artists are doing. So, you know, I'll give this example independently, like the National Arts Council should open their doors. They should be in there, they should be engaging with the artists who are protesting. They shouldn't lock up every time there's a threat that artists are going to come. These are artists. These are artists. They're peace-loving, giving types. And the reaction from the NAC is exactly what they shouldn't do. And if they chose to consider something else, the results would be completely different.
Okay, we're going to move this side. Let's start with Palisa. Yeah.
Hi everyone, my name is Balisa Sultan. I just wanted to add on what Maria was saying, that it's really important for institutions and government people to actually interact with cultural practitioners and artists. It's not enough to sit behind your desk and read these research papers when you don't know exactly what is happening in art galleries and museums. Our museums are in a state of emergency right now, but I hear so many people from government, Department of Arts and Culture are here today, but we never see them when the galleries have exhibition openings, when there's a cultural event. So we really need you guys to actually come forward into these spaces where we are interacting on these issues that are being presented to you guys from our researchers such as Maria, and really interact with us, because there's no way that you can understand what the problem is that you're fixing if you're not engaging with it directly. And that's all I had to say.
All right. Okay. Here? Okay, we can go at the back.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Mhlanganisi Masucha from Department of Small Business. Maybe a question for Professor N and also Dr. Josh. Maybe for the panel. In terms of the clusters, how do you ensure sustainability or continuity? Are there any legislative framework we're proposing? Because in South Africa we have spoken and started what we call cultural precincts, cultural hubs, and very soon the very government and city would decide that, no, we want to build something else here and move the artists out. I mean, the market or the Newtown Cultural Precinct is dead now. A few years ago it was thriving, but because in terms of just city planning, that cultural precinct has just been destabilized. And then the second part of that, maybe what Prof. N mentioned, was the issue of how we do not displace communities that are in that space where you want to bring in partners. If you take the Maboneng development, it's a great development, but the community that has been living there, a black community, some of them in some of the sort of squatted like circumstance, is being pushed out, how do you again ensure maybe, how did you do it well such that you still ensure that the community that is based there is not pushed out by this when you bring in maybe a partner to redevelop the area and create these creative clusters? Thanks.
Oh, thank you. Thanks very much. I really appreciate that question. I learned so much from working with this new team at the National Endowment for the Arts, and one of the things I really admired was how this man who owns 4 theaters on Broadway, who was our new chairman of the endowment, decided that he was going to travel 1 week out of every month to go around to all these different places in the United States. And he started in Chicago, and he stood on the steps of the Chicago Art Institute, and he said, of course, you know, you're not like Peoria. Peoria is a much smaller city down the Mississippi River from Chicago. And he recounts that the people from Peoria called him the next day and said, do you think we don't have any culture here? You have to come down here. And so he did. And because he was a Broadway producer and had really never been out of New York, owned 4 theaters, very successful, he learned so much from doing this. And it enabled him and Joan Shigakawa, who had been a funder for a long time, together as a team to really develop a very complex and open-minded strategy for their funding thing, which included that every project that asked for National Endowment for the Arts funding had to have at least one public sector agency involved with a point person on that, and one nonprofit arts organization. And they could be more of all of those together also asking for the funding. And that I thought was very brilliant and an example of how somebody who knew how to raise money for theater on Broadway could segue over into figuring out a strategy that would work for the new funding program where they were redirecting the way that they used the National Endowment for the Arts, which is not a huge organization, by the way, but anyway, thank you very much for that question.
Prof. Josh? I don't know if you can hear me. There was a question that I was asked earlier on. Would you please respond? Okay.
Yeah, I don't think I can respond really fully to the question about changing practices, burial rites. But the pandemic has definitely had a big impact on that. I suppose the issue for that agency around social cohesion, you know, is the feelings of incomplete death, really, that are pervasive, you know, unresolved death and ritual that are pervasive in rural areas. So, I mean, with Nelly, we presented some of this work at WUSU and the University of Zululand so far. Those are the only 2 places we've sort of had. And it was really interesting how the audiences, these issues were live in their, you know, in their lives, these unresolved. I'm not just talking about poor rural women, but I mean, lecturers, professors. We're talking about how their own families are trying to renegotiate ritual where, you know, slaughtering, it didn't take, beer wasn't brewed, all these sort of shortcuts and that had to be taken or were enforced on people have had a profound impact. And I think it will take, you know, a long time to work through those things. I think, you know, in mental illness was one of the issues that was raised here, I think pretty pervasive across all sectors in the pandemic. I just want to add a little anecdote about the creative arts, actually. I recently, literally 4 days ago, was in the city of Detroit with a huge funder, Kresge Foundation, together with Ford. But anyway, one of the stories that was really fascinating to me was that this guy was telling us, well, I was asking questions about, you know, Detroit's kind of recovered from complete bankruptcy. And how did they recover from bankruptcy? They had no assets as a city except the paintings in the Detroit Institute of Art. Diego Rivera, Frida Kahlo, etc. And the way they refinance the city, great irony actually, is to hand over the kind of public ownership of these incredibly valuable pieces of art to foundations like the Ford Foundation, which paid hundreds of millions to buy them, and then they had to use that money to refloat one of the great American industrial cities, had to be refloated on that creativity. And actually, it's kind of not doing too badly, I must say. It really is, I mean, it's one of those things Anne speaks about, you know, how Pennsylvania, which are also Penn State University, I mean, that area has just kind of become a retail, you know, people have been, it's a lot of gentrification. But Detroit is a much more kind of really struggling city. It struggles with different issues than we do, but I mean, it really is, it involves so much collaboration to get things done. And I mean, I also recognizing here, you know, individual people, including Anne's story, is predicated on her own agency and leadership in winning that award, ensuring that magazine comes out every 2 weeks, etc. And similarly, there's a woman called Sue Mosley who is she knows every street trader in Midtown Detroit. Without her, it's very difficult to imagine that the creatives, and they have an amazing new cultural precinct thing that I haven't read completely, but it's Detroit Cultural District, which she gave me as I was leaving. I've just kind of read half of it. Yeah, and it just shows such great progress for, you know, for culture.
Okay, so we have less than 10 minutes, so we're going to give Dr. Josh a chance to add or respond to the question that was asked earlier on. And after that, I will just ask for one question for Eric over there. So the next question from this audience will be for Eric. All right, thank you. You can go ahead.
All right, great, thank you. And yes, really, really interesting presentations. I've learned a lot from this panel, and yeah, just lots of really interesting insights. I think two things to say. One, relating to the question about kind of around the issue of gentrification. I mean, I think that's a really big issue, and it's something that we've seen a lot of in the UK, where there have been a lot of efforts to redevelop more deprived areas that have then just had the impact of pushing people out, and in some ways kind of losing some of the things that made those areas a bit more special. And so I think there's a really interesting tension, particularly when we're talking about capital investment and, you know, large scale kind of infrastructure and redevelopment, about how we actually spread that line in terms of actually not just introducing and in saying, okay, well, we've got this creative area, we're going to go and build a load of apartments and a load of housing and everything else, and don't worry, we'll put in, you know, 1 or 2 artist studios, and there we go, that's fine. There's that box ticks, move on. There's something more that's deeper about the ecosystem that I think we need to be appreciating as these developments are going on. There's a very interesting question in the chat, which, if it's all right, I might respond to from Gerald. He's asking about questions about differences in life cycles depending on the locations of clusters between big cities and more remote areas. And this is a really interesting question, and it's something that we've done a bit of work on. We've recently done some work on rural creative microclusters and how they're different. And I think what we're seeing from that work and from colleagues who are working in that space is we're definitely seeing that there are distinctive characteristics of clusters in more peripheral locations, because there's not so many large large agglomerations of, big communities of people. Actually, it's much smaller communities of people, and they may be much more geographically dispersed. And I think being aware of those and the nature of those as it relates to clusters, and also in some cases, I mean, in the UK and also elsewhere, I mean, we also have, UK has a booming film and television industry, which is very interesting in that it's sort of a cluster, but it's not a geographical cluster. It's a sectoral cluster that is clustered around
Dr. Josh, I've just been informed that we are really running out of time. So
in that case, I will stop there.
Thank you so much. So we just have one question, Eric, just 1 minute. A question, just one question for Eric. Is there a question this side? Yeah, sure.
Hello, my name is Tawanda, Muafrika. Generally, I would like to just thank you for the presentations and...
Please just ask the question.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Generally, when it comes to opportunities, being an African in South Africa, I understand needing to prioritize creating opportunities for South Africans since we're in South Africa. But generally, accessing opportunities, let's say funding or art competitions or accessing the sector, usually the criteria for qualification demands a South African ID or permanent residence. So there is a apartheid disc situation whereby Africans here in South Africa, but then also across borders, not just in South Africa, there is a need for including Africans in opportunities. I would like to ask you or challenge you to please find ways of including Africans in opportunities that are created in these discussions. Thank you.
Okay.
You want to challenge me?
So, yeah. Eric, please respond. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, but this is really what the essence of what I was trying to convey is that I feel as a practitioner, there's been a lot of talks and people highlighting the needs for institution and government to really talk with the artists and to really know what they think and what they made of, what are their thoughts, and consider that. I think that there's a lot of opportunities, to get access to them. There's a process, and we are asking artists to just acquire a series of skill sets to allow them to be able to talk to bankers, to allow them to present, to make projection, financial projection, economical impact, to get that language to be able to secure those fundings. And the case I'm making is that there are people who are experts, who are knowledgeable to do those type of tasks. And there are artists who are good at expressing themselves and are packaging their product. What I'm saying is just we just need to understand that funding is one source of revenues, but the impact of creative practitioners has an economical impact, which a whole value chain of companies and institutions and organization in the private sector benefit from. So the call is for artists, number one, to have a sense of business. I meet a lot of artists. I'm traveling from both sides. So as an artist, I understand what's going on. But as an organizer who have to go for some fundings, we need to have a closer collaboration with the private sectors and institutions in order to distribute fundings and opportunities based on some sort of revenues. Revenue doesn't need to be completely financial. I think that sometimes, the power of gathering an audience towards a collective experience, this is the value of marketing companies. This is the value of social media. How many people can you bring into your realm? So I think this is the way to be inclusive. Just like for institution, government, and private sector to work together to design packages to support the artist.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to our panelists for their contributions to this session. Just a few announcements. There's just over 10 minutes before we go into our breakaway sessions. Before we leave, just a note that we are talking about the creative economy here, the potential that it can bring just outside these doors. Are people selling their incredible wares, their heritage, their art and their culture? Please support them by buying their wares so the practicality of what we're talking about inside here can be reflected outside there. A reminder of the tour of Tshwane and the Javid Arts Center. We'd love to socialize with you and have you engage with people from the conference. That's absolutely free. You can experience things from the union buildings to the beautiful jacarandas that are in full bloom. Please log on to the conference website to sign up for that. Just a reminder for those of us joining online that the Myra board is there for you to leave your comments in the session. If you are in the room as well, you can also leave your questions and comments as we are short on time on the Myra board. A reminder that when it comes to lunch and snacks, there are halal, kosher and vegetarian catering options for delegates. Please ask for vouchers for those at the reception. We now have a 11-minute tea break before we go to our breakaway sessions. Thanks so much for your time and attention. See you soon. Can you get it? Sorry? Are you with the, I think they're outside.
Ola has always dreamed of connecting his culture to his passion, design. He runs a small business, a successful furniture design micro-enterprise, and employs a few people, mostly women. Ola and his team are part of the cultural and creative industries. You may ask yourself, what are creative industries? Creative industries are businesses and organizations that have creativity at their heart. These include, but are not limited to, architecture, fashion, photography, film, music, gaming, design, heritage, and television.
What the creative industries look like in South Africa. So a mapping study is not really a policy document, it's something that feeds into policy. So if you can't measure something, you can't manage it, you can't design policies, you can't track the policies that you have put in place to see how well they've been doing. And around the COVID period, it was also really important to track what was happening to the creative industries and their recovery.
Ola and his team are part of a great creative force of 1 million creative workers. That is 6% of all South Africa's workforce. Together, they contributed 161 billion rand to the economy in 2020 alone, just under 3% of GDP. That is approximately the same size as the agriculture sector and just slightly smaller than the construction industry. But starting and managing a creative enterprise has not been easy for Ola.
It's important for the industry to understand what the impact of their work is for their own businesses, and also, to understand what impact they're actually making to society.
In 2016, Ola moved from the Eastern Cape to the Western Cape to fulfill his long-term dream of starting his very own furniture business. While he was in the Eastern Cape, he acquired skills and techniques to equip him with tools needed to start his business. The Eastern Cape accounts for 7.5% of South Africa's creative activity, while the Western Cape accounts for 12.4%, and Ola had dreams of expanding his horizons.
So there are three main things. The first one is the contribution to GDP, so that's like the money, the rands. The second one is the people who are employed in the sector, so how many jobs are we talking about, and what kind of jobs are there, and what's happening with transformation and gender balance and so on. And then the third thing is international trade. So what sort of volumes of trade are we seeing South Africa exporting to other countries? Where does it go? Where do our cultural goods and services go? And then what do we import from the rest of the world?
After setting up his business and a way to develop his market, Ola often sold his locally designed and produced furniture products at local weekend markets in Cape Town. As a budding entrepreneur, Ola noticed that his business was impacted by general economic trends. The creative economy is sensitive to ups and downs of the broader South African economy. It grows quickly when the economy rises, but drops very fast when the economy slows down. Ola is no different, as his stall at the market has done better and better, and he has grown his customer base. Ola has begun to employ more people to assist him with his work. He is among the many creatives in South Africa who have created more and more jobs in the creative sector, and who have increasingly traded South African creative work internationally. He has especially grown his customer base in Europe and America. South Africa's first.
I would love to know what creative is. I created a lot of